And now it's time to introduce our keynote speaker today. Richard Evans is highly sought after as a speaker and clinician because of the work, his studies and workshops on innovation, organizational change, capacity building. And we're particularly interested today in his exploration of the relationship between cultural policy and emerging practices in the arts. His full biography, of course, is in your programs, and I encourage you to take a look at the information on Richard on his own website. He's the founding president of EMC Arts. Please welcome Richard Evans.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you a lot. Thank you very much, Rob, and it's great to be back in Vancouver and with you all this morning. My illustrious compatriot, Winston Churchill, to whom I don't refer often, once commented on this whole idea of success. He said the definition of success is moving from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. So I look back on my career to date and I see many successes of that kind. I often think of it as a sort of slow but rather persistent descent through the music and arts field. When I was ever so young, I was a composer. I wrote all sorts of pieces for my friends at school, and then it seems to me the very top of the profession. And but then in my teens, I began to discover what I thought of as real composers I wanted to be part of and whose work I wanted to do rather than just try and imitate them. So I took my first step down and became a flute player and did all that youth orchestra stuff you do and toured around the country in the UK and in Scandinavia for quite a while. But when I went up to Cambridge University to study, I discovered there's a flute player under every rock. And so that was completely hopeless. So I took my next step down and became a conductor, which, as every musician will tell you, is definitely a step down. I did a lot of conducting, but that was just too damned hard. I mean, you have to be an actor and a manager, you have to have incredible ear and all that. So when I left university, I took my really decisive step downward and became an arts manager, which, as all artists will tell you, is a pact with the devil. And I ran a big international festival in the city of Bath in England, the International Festival of Music and the Arts, for about a decade. And then I came to the United States, and the next step down was to become a foundation executive, with due apologies to anyone who's in that position. And I joined an organization called the National Arts Stabilization Fund in New York, which is a terrific agency all about long-term financial planning and reserves and balance sheets and things like that, with the worst name ever, I think. And so I did that for a while. Then it was time for another downward slip. So I became an independent consultant for about a decade and worked on my own and with others until eventually I took my so far final step, which was to incorporate as a non-profit organization. So here I am running a service organization in the arts, and there ain't much further to go, unless I become a music critic. Or maybe in the United States a Republican strategist. But I'm not going either of those places soon. So I'd like to begin with just a few stories about others, not about me this morning, and run you through some of the ideas that have informed the work we're doing at EMC Arts across the United States and beginning to do in Canada. And then see if I can make some relationship between all that and this idea of cultural policy, whatever that means. Let me start with a couple of stories. You'll know the Center for the Performing Arts, the Los Angeles Music Center, it's generally called, up on the hill at the center of downtown Los Angeles, these great palaces of culture, one of the biggest presenters on the West Coast and very famous organization, the Mark Taper Forum, the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, and so on. A great organization, but about 7 years ago, a lot of the staff began to realize that, the plazas all around those buildings where they were working were empty almost all the time, unless people were either coming into a show or they were leaving one. And that whole area of downtown Los Angeles next to Disney Hall had a rather empty feel most of the time. So they thought, what can we do to enable this area of town to be more artistic, more engaged? So one evening on a Wednesday, they put down a dance floor on one of the plazas, and they rigged up lights and arranged music and invited people to come and dance, not to watch a dance performance, just come and dance. and a couple hundred people turned up just to come and participate in that way. They called it active arts. So they started doing this regularly every Wednesday evening and then every Friday as well. And they began to think, well, this is something we could perhaps do in other art forms. So they started a drumming circle. They started storytelling circles. They started a Get Your Chops Back orchestra, where if you were a rusty musician who'd played in your youth, you could come and scrape the rust off with your friends from around town. They even started a massed flute choir, which as a reformed flutist I can tell you is the worst noise you'll ever hear. Really bad. And suddenly there were thousands of people coming every weeknight and on the weekends as well, and often at lunchtime, to join in these activities. So much so that people started to say, I want to register because I may not get my place in the orchestra, I may not get my place on the dance floor. And they introduced registration fees, just $5 to begin with. But now, according to the activity, between $30 and $50 a time, and still the numbers are rising. And tens of thousands of people are engaged in these activities. And what was once a little experiment on a Wednesday evening has become a major revenue source for the Music Center. And perhaps most important, a couple of years ago, the County of Los Angeles decided to renovate the park opposite the Music Center. And they offered it to the Music Center for programming. And the trustees of the Music Center, these illustrious trustees of this very large organization, all voted that 100% of the programming should be active arts. So now we have millions of dollars coming from the county to support the growth of active arts across Los Angeles in the park and elsewhere. And it's becoming, in fact, one of the signature programs of this institution. My second story is closer to home. It's in the Portland, Oregon, the art museum there. A lovely mid-sized art museum with a lot of great artifacts from the Pacific Northwest, that realized a few years ago that they had very little in their collection or in the way they did business that really helped them to express the life of the citizens of Portland now. What could they do to have their museum be more expressive of the life of their community? So they had this idea. They called it object stories. And they said what we'll have people do is think of an object in the museum that they have a really strong relationship with, that they really adore, and have people come and make 3-4-minute videos about that object and tell the story of their relationship with it. They created a booth near the back of the museum, just next to the gift store as you go out. And then put in video cameras and all that, and they invited people to do this. And so they made, 10 or 20 of these videos as an experiment. And then they had lots of people come in and look at them, and they sort of focus grouped it. And everyone agreed that these videos were really dull. Really dull, yeah. They're too long. And it was just this person to video, it's not very interesting. They couldn't have the object with them because it was an object from the museum. So what I find interesting about this project is they didn't stop. They just changed it and prototyped it again and again and again. And it changed so much during this time. First of all, they realized that the booth where you make your object story shouldn't be at the back of the museum as you're going out. It should be at the front as you come in. And there you see it, if you're lucky. There it is. That lovely red booth near the first thing you see as you come into the museum. The second thing they realized is that the medium was wrong. Video was not the medium. It had to be audio. And the third thing they realized was, of course, not just to limit it to objects from the museum, but to ask people to engage with an object from their lives that mattered to them, whether it was an object in the museum, which it might be, or whether it was an old wallet, and tell that story. So now when you go to the Portland Art Museum, you can go into this booth, you sit down on a bench, there's a video screen with 6 carefully selected prompts. You have 45 seconds to respond with your audio track about you and your object. And at the end, it takes 3 still photographs of you holding that object. They thought the photograph should be at the beginning, but they realized they should be at the end because by then most people are crying. And they found this way to create these astonishingly expressive stories about people's lives and things that are important to them. And since then, hundreds of people have come in and made their object stories. And when you go to the Portland Art Museum now, the first thing you see as you come in is this permanent exhibit of the names that they've given their stories and the pictures they took. And you can go up to any of these consoles and listen and watch to any of the nearly 300 object stories that people have now made. And it's completely changed their relationship with their community. They're now exporting it to the schools and working with school kids to create their own object stories for display in the schools. My last story is just about the Memphis Symphony Orchestra, a mid-sized American orchestra that, until about 7 or 8 years ago, had a pretty traditional mission statement. You know how American orchestras at least love to say they're going to be world-class, every single one of them. And they're going to play to the largest number of people and do recordings and international tours and all that. Well, the Memphis Symphony had a mission statement not unlike that, but it made a significant shift. It said, its new mission statement says that the job of the Memphis Symphony is to create meaningful experiences for the people of Memphis through music. And it's that shift that makes music the means, not the end, and the vitality of Memphis, the real purpose, that opened so many doors in the community. The board, the staff, the musicians all went out into the community, and instead of asking, where can we play our wonderful music, they were asking, how can we work with you and partner with you to help you meet your goals and your agenda? And this really did open doors all over the city for them, including at FedEx, which is headquartered in Memphis, with which they'd had a small relationship in the past as a sponsor of concerts. And FedEx said, our real issue is advanced leadership training for our middle and senior managers. We can't get hold of that. And the musicians of the orchestra put together a program of leadership development. They call it Leading from Every Chair. That uses the orchestra as a metaphor for dispersed leadership. You sit in the orchestra. You listen to rehearsals. You conduct the orchestra. And the middle managers and senior managers of FedEx became involved over the next 3 years in a remarkable growth of this program, which the symphony sold to them as a fee-for-service arrangement. And it's become tremendously successful. FedEx has taken it around the country. The symphony has used it with many other corporations. And perhaps more important, the musicians of the symphony designed this program entirely themselves. And that's not the way that you think of American orchestras doing program development, usually. And they were so empowered by that experience, they've gone on to create another 8 or 9 community-based programs of different kinds. To such an extent, the symphony tells me they reach 6 times as many people through those programs as they do through their standard concert series. And they bring in about 15% of their total income. So my question in a way for this morning is, what's going on here? Why is it that these organizations, whether they're large or small or mid-sized, are doing things so different, things they've never done before, things in some way that are countercultural to the things they are well known for? And that's the question we've been trying to explore in our work over the last few years. And I think the answer, in part at least, is that we are entering a new era for the arts, very different, I think, from what I see as the first phase of developing a professional arts sector, both here and in the United States. The old era, in my view, was structured for growth. We were establishing a professionalism in the arts beyond the major metropolitan areas in a way that had never been seen before. And everything was about growth, growth in the number of organizations, growth in audiences, growth in reach, growth in your finances. These were the ways in which organizations were measured in terms of success. And this agenda was propelled in the United States substantially by the Ford Foundation, which, as you may know, came into the arts as the first national philanthropy to make a significant investment in 1957. And over the next 25 years, it put literally billions of dollars into the expansion of the professional arts sector. And it wasn't just that it put a massive amount of money into it, it also had a particular strategy that a lot of other funders, when they came into existence, tended to follow. And that may sound like a story of an American foundation, but of course, the Canada Council was founded in 1958. And even when the Ford Foundation was doing its work, if you go into the archive, you can see the discussions where they say, you know, there are only 2 agencies that could do this. It's going to be us or it's going to be the federal government. In the US, perhaps typically, it was a private foundation. But here it was the federal government through the Canada Council and then through the provincial arts councils that pushed an agenda which was not dissimilar. And under both of those influences, I think, a lot of norms came into being in our field, which we've taken for granted in many ways until, I think, the last 5 or 10 years. In the performing arts, for instance, this idea of subscription selling. The Ford Foundation introduced Danny Newman from the Lyric Opera of Chicago to work with companies all over the country in theater, in the symphony as well as the opera, to create this new idea of selling whole seasons and building audience loyalty and cash flow as a result. And that became a norm. It became the way we do business, at least until the last few years. Most of Ford's grants were matching grants, and it really led to the idea that we have to have an annual campaign, a fundraising campaign from individuals to make the Ford match was often the way it was spoken of. And that in turn led to our trustees here, I think, as well as in the United States, getting wealthier as they got larger and becoming the major donors and cultivators of new support for our organizations. In due course, after 10 years or so, the Ford Foundation turned to the question of permanence. It had created so many organizations, it had expanded so many, often initially directly funding artists to create organizations and then moving on to organizational support for those institutions, that it realized it needed to provide endowments. So the latter stages of this strategy turned towards endowment funding in order to try and strengthen the permanence of these institutions. And all these, I think, became the principal norms. It's by far from being the whole story, of course, but it is one of the aspects of this first 50 years or so of professional arts development that I think has really stuck and has had a long legacy. It led, I think, to a fundamental value proposition, if you like, in the arts, which I call excellence and scarcity. The idea was to bring a level of quality, of performance, of exhibit to our communities in ways that had never happened before. But every excellence model brings with it a kind of scarcity. That is to say, we might extract the most talented musicians or artists from our communities, put them together in ensembles, and then sell them back to our communities at the highest ticket price that could be afforded. So there is a kind of scarcity mentality built into this very idea of excellence in our sector. But these dynamics and this particular proposition, I think, are now decisively over. And I think we're moving into a new era for the arts that I describe as being structured for resilience. And what I mean by that is the capacity of organizations to change and adapt rapidly to increasingly rapid changes in our environment without losing their capacity to build public value. And I think this new mandate to be structured for resilience is leading to a lot of change in the way our arts organizations function. It means, for instance, first of all, the capacity to operate successfully in what I'm calling complex adaptive systems. This first bullet carries a lot of punch. There's a lot of things wrapped up in that. One of them is, of course, higher adaptive capacities among our arts organizations, the ability to maneuver and change and take on new ventures and be really good at that, not just wander around in the dark. But it also means being able to deal with complexity, to being able to deal with belonging to a complex system of interdependency in which whatever we do affects whatever everyone else does, and what they do affects us. So we cannot act alone. We have to act together. So this is a very different set of capacities, I think, than we're used to in the past, when our organizations were essentially funded or thought about to be like islands, each doing their own thing. And among our unique selling points was how different is my organization from yours. This also, I think, means engaging with the creative potential across our communities in a much wider way than has been the case in the past. The National Endowment for the Arts does regular surveys of public participation in the arts. The last one was about 4 years ago. And for the first time, they expanded the reach of that survey to include not only what they call the benchmark activities, going to standard professional arts activities, the opera, the symphony, the ballet, a museum, and so on, but also to include activities which could happen in a church or a synagogue or a community center or even at home. And what they found is that 75% of Americans say that the arts are really important to them. They play a role in their daily lives, and they are engaged in the arts in that way, but only 34% said they expressed that interest through any connection with a professional arts institution at all. And only 8% said they did so exclusively through an institution of that kind. So you have to imagine that despite this 50 years or so of developing the sector, we've kind of painted ourselves into a relatively small corner of the expressive life of the country as a whole. And this, in fact, is a massive opportunity. The Canada Council has done similar work recently, and the results are indeed similar. Not as dire, that discrepancy between maybe 34% and 75% here in Canada, but not far off. There is this sense of a huge opportunity of a level of creative interest and activity in our communities which is not currently at all engaged with our professional arts institutions. If we can bridge that gap, if we can reach out or engage in new ways, then this is a time of, I think, great opportunity. But it will mean much more nimble and open organizations, structured for collaboration, structured to be part of our communities in new ways. And Sam Jones, the worker at DEMOS, the Cultural Research Institution in London, wrote recently that the role of the cultural professional is changing from a model of provision to one of enabling. And I think in some ways that sums up the shift that's going on in our sector. We used to say a great city has a great orchestra, has a great museum, whatever. And that's not good enough any longer. What we're saying now is a great city has a rich, expressive life among its citizens. And that's a different mandate, and a bolder one, actually. And it rests on a very different value proposition, I think. I call it abundance and intimacy. A recognition of the abundance of creative talent and interest in our communities, and a kind of customer intimacy that's routine in other sectors, but has not, I think, been a driving force in the arts so far. So this is a real big shift in the way our arts organizations are conceived, how they operate, and what their policies are. Another way to look at it might be to say that for a long time we thought that the route to effectiveness and sustainability lay through this idea of stability. As our organizations grew, like sunflowers on long stalks, they would in a sense be propped up by all sorts of capacities and competencies that would help them have that permanence. And we underpinned that with all these kinds of moves that were in many ways very successful. We built technical competences in marketing, in production, in fundraising, in operations, in finances. And we organized our staff into pretty typical hierarchical departments based on a pretty 1950s corporate model. And that led to a lot of command and control cultures in our organizations. Organizations that are really good at maintaining quality and keeping on doing what we have been doing, but actually tend to resist the idea of doing something different, of actually being divergent and thinking about new opportunities. And we underpinned all that with rational strategic planning, the attempt to lay out a 5-year plan that made the future look like the past, only more so. I wrote rational. I realized, well, what's irrational strategic planning? And then, of course, I realized there's lots of that. So maybe there is such a thing. And we underpinned it with capital endowment and buildings. To grow up as an arts organization was to get your own building. What I think we found in the last 10 years, there is, in fact, a whole other dimension to the capacities that arts organizations are going to need if they're going to thrive in the future. I call it adaptability. And it's a very different set of capacities. For instance, the ability to have adaptive leaders, leaders who mobilize people to come together in new ways to address complex challenges. This is very different from the heroic leader that we've tended to focus on in the arts, whether they're an artistic, executive, or board leader, the idea that they have the vision, they have the answers, and everybody else follows. As they say nowadays, the problems are too wicked for any individual to be able to solve them. We need to come together in new ways. So adaptive leadership is called for, and that means much more cross-functional teamwork, or individuals in our organizations working in very new ways that cross these old boundaries that have tended to create silos, which will lead to, and is already beginning to lead to, much more collaborative cultures in our organizations, more entrepreneurial, more inclined to diverge rather than just conform. And I'm seeing changes in the way organizations think about their future, trying to lay out that traditional 3 to 5 year plan in circumstances where you can only be wrong after about 6 months, is giving way to the idea that can we build the muscles to be able to incubate innovations on a pretty consistent basis. They used to say, if you don't have a plan, if you don't know where you're going, then any route will take you there. Nowadays, I would say, if you are too certain about where you're trying to go, you'll miss all the opportunities along the way. So how do we learn to have these short-term feedback loops that can help us incubate innovations successfully? And I'm seeing changes in the balance sheets too. Instead of this focus on long-term permanent capital, much more emphasis on liquidity and on the kind of reserves that organizations can invest as risk capital or change capital in their innovations as they develop. Now, my point is not that everything up there on the left is bad and everything down here is good. It's just that we're going through a time, I think, when we need to find a new balance between these two sets of capacities. The futurist Kevin Kelly calls them clockware and swarmware. Clockware being all those things that keep us on the rails of business as usual, and swarmware being the ways in which we reimagine ourselves to do business in the future. We need a balance, and I think only if every organization in our sector and the sector as a whole achieves a new balance between these two sets of qualities, only then will the trajectory of our public value and impact continue to rise. South of the border, at least, we have, I think, a crisis in this area. 4 or 5 years ago, when the big stimulus package was first announced, $700 billion or so, the arts eventually, through the National Endowment, got $50 million, at the same level as roadside beautification. That was the level at which the arts were seen as worthy of investment. And I hear this as I go around the country more and more, that in fact there's so much competition from other sectors. There are new ways to do things. There's for-profit competition, that in fact the non-profit arts sector is being questioned for its ongoing public value. So I think we need to find this new kind of balance. And that means, I think, we have to be really clear about what kinds of challenges and opportunities organizations are facing. I'm taking this from Ronald Heifetz, the director of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, who makes, I think, a useful distinction between what he calls technical challenges, which are the kinds of challenge that organizations can usually solve by improving what you're currently doing. You don't need a big breakthrough change here. You just need to get better at what you're currently doing. That means adopting best practices, maybe bringing in a consultant who can help tune up what you're doing toward those best practices, and you can solve the problem. We know these problems really well. right? We turn up for work every day thinking, how can we improve what we're doing? How can we get a better return? How can we be more efficient? And these will always go on being really important problems to tackle. But Heifetz makes the point we're going through a period of time when a different kind of challenge is becoming more and more important. He calls them adaptive challenges. And adaptive challenges are the ones where there is no set solution. There's no one you can bring in from outside the organization that can give you a range of options, and you pick one, you can probably solve the issue. You have to diverge from what you've done in the past and question ingrained assumptions in order to come up with a new way forward. So one of the questions might be, how do you tell the difference? Heifetz has a nice line on that. I think he says, if you throw all the technical fixes you can at the problem, and the problem persists, it's a pretty sure sign there's an underlying adaptive challenge that has yet to be met. So often I think it's about those things that keep us up at night, the things about our organizations or our practice where we know there's something not working or something that needs to change, but we're not quite sure what it is, but it won't go away. For a performing arts organization, it might be that box office downturn that was a blip 2 years ago. And we thought we'd got it sorted. We changed our marketing. We did more on the web. And here we are 2 years later, and to be honest, the trend is still downward. We thought we'd fixed it, but it hasn't gone away. It's often these persistent challenges that tell us that we need to do something adaptive. One of the things I've learned in doing this work is we spend a lot of time disguising our adaptive challenges to make them look as if they're technical, right? Because we'd much rather they were. We know how to deal with technical challenges. We have all these coping mechanisms, whether it's the board members who will write an extra check at the end of the year to make it look as though the business model is working when it's really not, or those thousands of hours of unpaid staff time that people put in order to make it look as though we've got enough infrastructure when we haven't. There's all sorts of ways in which we disguise the need to adapt and make it look as though we can just solve it by improving what we do, or we don't need to actually solve it at all. Another way to look at these challenges, which I think is relevant to our thinking about policy, is through this lens. Here you have 4 sort of quadrants, I suppose. And on the bottom right here, we have the chocolate chip cookie. The point here is that even somebody as clumsy as I can order the right ingredients, follow the recipe, and come up with a pretty reasonable chocolate chip cookie. It's actually a simple problem. If I follow the guidelines, if I follow the recipe, I'm probably going to get it right. And on the top right, we have the space rocket. This is a hell of a lot more complicated, but it's still knowable. The relationship between cause and effect is complicated, but it's still linear. If we can find the right engineers, if we get a really good blueprint, and if those engineers specializing in different parts of the rocket can work together, we can build a space rocket. It's knowable. It's a complicated problem. And then there's parenting. When you're not even sure what the problem is. And you can be sure that the solution of yesterday isn't going to be the right solution for tomorrow. The relationship between cause and effect is circular. And there's great uncertainty about how on earth we can intervene to try and solve this. And this is a complex problem. So I want to draw your attention to these 3 different kinds of problem, because some very brilliant people in Scandinavia and then here in Canada have turned that into a framework to say, okay, if these are the different kinds of challenges we face, how do we intervene? What can we do to actually try and solve them? And they came up with what's called the Cynefin framework, which may be familiar to some of you. It's an old Welsh word, strange and interesting Welsh word that has something to do with place, but also hidden histories. And what they've said is that when we're dealing with, let's see if we can get this. Yes, there it is. If we're dealing with simple problems, what we need is best practices. When the relationship between cause and effect is linear and close coupled, we can follow the recipe, we can bring in best practices, and we'll get a good result. When we're dealing with complicated problems like the space rocket, what we need is expert assistance. All those people who are technically qualified to know about different parts of the rocket can help us achieve that. We need expert assistance, or what we often call in the arts, technical assistance, to help us solve that. But when we come to the top left and the complex challenges where the relationship between cause and effect is no longer linear, but in some kind of circling motion, what we need to do is create the conditions for emergent practice. We cannot impose a solution. We cannot bring in people from the outside, no matter how brilliant their expertise. We have to find a way for the system to resort itself and realign that leads to next or emergent practices. And then, of course, there's chaos down here, which we know parenting can descend into, where there's really no relationship between cause and effect whatsoever. And in those circumstances, all you can do is stabilize something in the system, then see where you are. But the point really is to deal with complex adaptive challenges that I think our sector is now facing as it goes through this time of transition from the old to the new era. And in that circumstance, in that environment, what we find is that we have to innovate. We have to learn how to do things differently that we've never done before. And when we're innovating, when we're in the situation of trying to innovate, I think we're often in a place where it looks like this. And I acknowledge my colleague Jamie Gamble from all the way across in New Brunswick, with whom we're working on all this, who's a great developmental evaluation specialist in Canada. And I'm borrowing his slides with his permission. We often want to think it looks like that, and if we lay out a plan with all those nice steps to it, we will indeed be able, over time, to achieve our vision. But actually, it turns out to look like this, which is a bit of a problem. Our traditional approaches to how we can think about planning for the future are really confounded by the fact that we're not even sure what the problem is, let alone what the solution is. And there's some back and forth relationship between our knowledge of the problem and our capacity to solve it. And we often feel we're in a situation like this, right? We don't know which way to go, and every way seems to be cut off. One of the reasons I think addressing complex adaptive challenges is like that is because it calls upon us to question the assumptions which have been reliable predictors of success in the past in our organizations or in our practice, whatever role we play inside the arts ecology. And every organization has assumptions of that kind. They start off as things you try out. When you're founding a company or when you're joining an organization, you try out some strategies, and things that don't work you discard, but things that do, you may tweak them a bit, you may learn from that, but over time, for you and your colleagues, they become an accepted way of doing things, the way we do things around here. And they become reliable predictors of success for the future, whether that's the way you price the house in a performing arts center, the choice of repertoire in an organization, the assumptions you have, in fact, about the kind of people who are going to show up at your exhibits or your performances, the way you'll relate to your community. All organizations operate on these assumptions because they're shortcuts. And when people join the organization, they quickly learn about the way we do things and the assumptions that we hold together. Edgar Schein, the great scholar and practitioner of organizational culture, he made up the word, made up the phrase, puts this very well. He says that assumptions in organizations begin as successful solutions to problems, reliable predictors of success. What was once a questionable hypothesis about how we should proceed becomes a reality that we take for granted. And as we take these for granted, so they slip out of sight into the mists of institutional memory or into the bedrock of our organization. And this is fine so long as life goes on being how it was and nothing changes. But because these things have gone down into the subconscious of our organizations, they tend to be not only undiscussed, but undiscussable. And therefore, when things change, they live well beyond their sell-by dates. And our organizations go on operating on assumptions that actually don't hold anymore, but we'd much rather they did. So we disguise or we don't look at the evidence that suggests that those assumptions are in fact no longer reliable predictors of success, because it's much easier to design an organization to do that. But as Schein goes on, the kicker is that in order to innovate, organizations have to resurrect, examine, and then break the frame created by old assumptions. This is really difficult work. It's the work that we focus on doing, the roots of innovation, in my view, because unless organizations can question their own assumptions and look at the evidence coolly to see whether it supports or contradicts those assumptions, and where it contradicts them, actually let go of those assumptions and come up with a new hypothesis, a new framework, a new proposition for the future, they'll never be able to innovate. Because what happens is you try something out, you create a new strategy, but over time, usually over 6 months, no more than that, the strategy starts to erode back to being just a slight tweak of business as usual. This happens again and again and again in our organizations because of the lack of having stepped back and shifted our assumptions. It was this that led us to our working definition of innovation. When we started this work about 7 or 8 years ago, there's a definition a day in the corporate sector for innovation, but there was very little in the non-profit sector that seemed to work, so we made one up. And it's got a lot of traction in the last few years. The idea is that innovation is a kind of organizational change, and it has these 3 elements to it. This shift in assumptions that I've been talking about, the idea that these new pathways or strategies are unlike your past practice in your organization. They're discontinuous from that. We often call them the next illogical step. And you could do that. You could create a new way forward that was based on a new assumption and was unlike what you'd done before, and still be involved in change for change's sake. So we thought it was important to recognize, well, why would you do this? Why would you go to all this effort and potentially expense to do something different? Only if it promised to be genuinely a new pathway to achieving public value and impact. So we added on that third piece. Originally, actually, we said new pathways to achieving the mission. But we found in our work that actually when organizations get into thinking this through and beginning to act on it, they begin to change their mission statements quite often. So we looked beyond the mission statement to the ultimate purpose of public value that our organizations exist for. This is not intended to be some kind of litmus test. It's just a way to have a conversation that seems to set the bar at a useful height for talking about this kind of change. So I'd like to convert some of these ideas into what we're actually seeing in the field in terms of new approaches for these days. We're seeing all sorts of areas of innovative practice. The biggest circle here is about new ways of engaging with our communities, engaging people in artistic experiences. This means new kinds of program formats. It means new venues, going to very new places, different places to engage people. This means the Rossini opera in the empty swimming bath. It means Sleep No More in abandoned warehouses. It means all sorts of new venues that are taking shape. It also means involving the public in co-creating arts experiences instead of just a supply-side dynamic. It's a dialogue with our audiences around the nature of the work. And it's using the web, not just as a transactional tool for communications, but as a center of creativity and a way to engage our audiences in new ways. This is a huge part of the innovations I see going on in our organizations. And it's very difficult because a lot of organizations have an ingrained sense that their job is to be the supplier of products. And a lot of funders in the US are looking to other kinds of organizations, and some moving rather quickly away from the established arts infrastructure, which I don't think is a good idea. But it's not only this. There's a lot more things we're seeing too. One of them that's most important I call giving organizational agency to artists. In my perspective, the affiliation between artists and organizations is a pretty poor one in many cases. We often sequester our creative assets to be only about creation and production, where artists are tremendous institutional problem solvers, lateral thinkers. And in all our innovation teams we put together, we always insist on having artists at the table, not to represent the programmatic point of view, but as full institutional members and problem solvers. And I'm seeing new ways that organizations are looking at how artists can relate to them, and artists thinking about new ways they can affiliate with organizations that don't fall into traditional paths. Another thing we're seeing is a lot of much more extended collaborations. Thinking collaboratively, thinking about joint action and collective impact is an area for a tremendous amount of innovation, I think, as well as actually the restructuring of our organizations to deliver services in new ways and to fit the demands of this new kind of business that we're in, even to the extent of partnerships and mergers happening a lot more in the sector. Merger used to be the sort of dirty word of the sector. If two organizations got really, really weak, you'd say, well, why don't they merge? That was a great strategy. Now I'm seeing strong organizations merge because they recognize they want to achieve critical mass and a new kind of footprint that they can't do alone. And all these different areas of innovation in some sense are, I think, interconnected. And they reflect and reinforce each other. And we're seeing organizations often look across more than one of these domains as they try to change. Many of you will be familiar with the work of Alan Brown, of Wolf Brown, who did some terrific work, I think, on these different modes of participation. It's a simple analysis of the different ways that people engage in the arts according to the level of creative control they have over that artistic experience. So ambient participation is the music in the elevator. You didn't have any choice about what it was, you just had to be in the elevator. It's the art show I saw yesterday in San Francisco Airport as I went through on the Travelator. It's a lot of public art. The observational is when you buy a ticket and you sit in the seat and you've agreed to be part of this performance at 8 p.m. tonight. You have no control over what happens on the stage, but you have made the choice to go in and observe that and be part of it. Curatorial is where you create an art collection of your own, whether that's literally pictures in your home or whether it's downloads and playlists and mashups that you make using technology to create artworks that are particularly your own. Interpretive, of course, is being the performer, and inventive is being the creator of the artwork. And the point here is not that arts organizations, I think, are abandoning any one of these, or particularly the observational. It's more that they're now beginning to make their decisions artistically and organizationally saying how can we ensure that for everything we do, there is a gateway of participation through each of these 5 different modes, or as many as we can, in everything that we do. And this is a really radical departure for the way that our arts organizations think. Many of them, in fact, are trying to address the problem which was neatly summed up in the New Yorker a few months ago. Here's a picture of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And the question, in a way, is how many of our arts organizations wear this banner unconsciously over their buildings, or even with pride. This has become a really big problem, I think. So another way just to look at innovation is to say it's about making new connections. So many of the arts organizations with which we work are trying to make new connections across one or more of these 3 domains. Almost every organization wants to make a new kind of connection with its community, but a great many are realizing it begins at home, that unless we can make new connections inside our organization, structure ourselves differently, work differently, we won't be able to sustain a new relationship with our community. So we're seeing organizations bring artists into new roles and break through some of the silos or barriers inside our organizations by having people come together in new kinds of teams. Even if it's a small organization with only one person in different departments, they scarcely are departments, nonetheless, there's an assumption of a kind of vertical isolation or insulation between these departments. It's now being broken by much more integration. We're also seeing organizations, as I say, merge or come together in partnerships to create critical mass. And we're seeing these new gateways of participation. How can we open up these different doorways of participation in what we do? And we're moving from a time of marketing products to passive consumers to engaging our audiences in process as well as product. So again, these are some of the changes we're seeing in the field as a whole. So this means new structures, and I wanted to just give you quickly a sense of some of the quite profound structural changes we're seeing in arts organizations and have done over the last 5 years. For my purposes, arts organizations are 8-pointed inlaid stars, because I have 8 things to say. That's the only reason. I'm sure you could come up with 8 other things. This is not supposed to be an exhaustive list. It's just 8 areas where we're seeing really important change going on in arts institutions. The first is around mission. I mentioned that with the Memphis Symphony, that it changed the mission statement from one which was all about outputs and achievements and how wonderful we're going to be, to one which was actually about the beneficiaries and the community and the impacts we're going to have. When I asked my friend Peggy Center, who runs the Community Music School in Concord, New Hampshire, what success would look like for the school, she could have said a lot of things. She could have said, when we get to 1,500 students a week, that'll be success. Or she could look at the percentage of students that go on to the 7 big music colleges and say, if that number rises, that's success for us. But she didn't say either of those things. She said, if I were to walk along the darkened streets of Concord at night and look in through the windows of people's homes and through the lighted windows see them playing music in their front rooms, that would be success. A very different definition of success. We're used to the idea of our artistic direction being handled by one individual or a group of curators inside our institution, but always by insiders. I don't think the role of the artistic leader is going away at all, but I am seeing a lot more adventurous artistic leaders involved much more in a dialogue with external voices. We saw this in a way with the Portland Art Museum and its object stories. And some of you may know the work of the Trey McIntyre Project, the dance company in Boise, Idaho, with its remarkable ways in which the leaders there have engaged with the community in 1,000 ways to break down the barriers between the organization and the community, even down to having drinks at the local bars named after the dancers. You can drink your way through the company, which people, I understand, do. This is also true about our creative capacity, I think. The idea that we selected the best artists we could, put them into our exhibits or into our ensembles, and presented them back to our communities from a distance. Instead, I'm seeing professional artists working 24/7 year-round with the creative community in a way that breaks through this idea of formal seasons. Again, the role of the professional artist is not going away, but I do believe it's changing in many ways. We're working with a small dance company in Cleveland right now called Groundworks. One of their latest initiatives is it's a video series called It's Your Move. And the idea was to challenge people in the community to find the choreography in their daily lives, whether they're a traffic cop directing the traffic or they're a checkout clerk at a supermarket checkout. What are the moves that you make? And they invited individuals to put these up on YouTube as their moves. Then the dancers from the company worked with them to interpret their moves and to incorporate those moves into the next piece of work they're putting on the stage. So a very different sense of how we can involve the community in our work. Organizational boundaries then, I think, are becoming much more porous. We used to differentiate ourselves really powerfully in order to raise funds and be distinct from our colleagues, from organizations in other sectors. I'm seeing an awful lot more now of commonalities, of reaching beyond the traditional boundaries of the organization, as we saw with Active Arts at the Music Center in Los Angeles. And it's affecting staffing as well. We're used to the idea of hierarchical departments and technical specialties. And one of the problems with that, even though it paid great dividends, was we created an awful lot of boring jobs in the arts. You know, if you're in the development department and your job every day is to put in the new data and keep the database up to date, you don't exactly feel really close to the artistic juice of the organization. And they're not only boring jobs, they're boring low-paid jobs. So what we get is immense turnover in the field and a loss of institutional memory. And we've now got, I think, a whole set of emerging leaders who are saying, I don't know that I want to take over the kind of organization I might inherit. So it's quite a crisis, I think, of staffing in our field. And what adventurous organizations are doing is they are restructuring across those departments using what some people call post-specialist workers to ensure that the teams that are put together have a direct relationship with the art that we're putting on the stage or on the walls or taking on tour. Marketing, of course, has changed very substantially from this idea of passive consumers and products to the idea of participants involved over a longer arc of engagement in the process of creating the artwork as well as in the product that comes out the other end. And governance, too, I think, is changing. Governance, I think, will be one of the biggest subjects over the next 20 years. We're used to the idea that our boards of trustees are our major funders and those that help solicit and give us support and find other supporters for our organizations. Often our boards are very large. They're larger, I think, in the US than here because of the individual giving that is the bedrock of most organizations. And sometimes you have a board of 45 to 60, which cannot govern. Simply cannot govern. So what you do is you create an executive committee of 12, and they make all the decisions, and everybody else feels left out, like a rubber stamp, so they don't want to come back. And so the whole cycle sort of goes on. I'm seeing boards get much smaller. The Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in California just reduced its board to 7. The Detroit Symphony, and symphonies always have among the biggest boards, reduced it from 65 to 25. And more important in a way, what I'm seeing happen in the States is a thin line is being developed between the idea of being a trustee or a director of the company and being a major donor. The one does not necessarily imply the other. So we're beginning to find other ways to respect and give visibility to and to honor our major donors without thinking or allowing that to make us believe that makes them a good trustee or a good director of the company. So a lot of change going on in governance and a lot of change happening with the financial profile as well. The problem with the old model of capitalization, with its emphasis on permanent capital and buildings, was that it slowed organizations down a great deal. And it meant they spent more and more of their time servicing those assets and sometimes less and less on the social benefits they were there to achieve. So I'm seeing a lot more emphasis on building liquidity, giving the change capital on the balance sheet so that we actually have the room to maneuver as we try and do new things. The Nonprofit Finance Fund in New York, as you may know, recently put out a monograph called The Case for Change Capital, which I recommend. It's a good analysis of these new kinds of capital that are coming into the field. Just a couple of examples of some organizations where these kind of practices are taking off. MAP International Productions in New York is a relatively small but very important multimedia producer and presenter. It commissions artists to do multimedia work and then sees it right the way through to staging in New York and then touring nationally and internationally. And their question, they became part of our innovation lab, their question was a great one. They said, when does the show start? And the answer wasn't Tuesday at 8 p.m. It was about 6 months before, because they realized that their patrons were interested in the creative journey of the artist. They wanted to meet the artist. They wanted to see rehearsal footage. They wanted to see the artist's journals. They wanted to be used as researchers by the artist. They wanted to have this combination of on and offline activities long before the piece was completed. And then when they'd seen it, the show went on for another 3 months after that because they wanted to talk to the artist about it. They wanted to talk to other people who'd been there about this whole thing. So the arc of engagement was maybe 8 or 9 months. Such a different thing from selling a ticket for Tuesday night. And they realized that they could actually monetize this new relationship in a kind of Kickstarter mode. So the access you get to the artist throughout this arc of engagement is dependent upon your giving. $5 here, $10 there, $15 there to get more access. And they've turned this into a very successful program that brings in a couple of 100,000 a year. The Hammer Museum in Los Angeles is a contemporary art museum in probably the coldest and most difficult building in the world, the Oxy Petroleum Building, all white marble. And you have to go ages to even find the galleries. It's on the campus of UCLA, but the museum could never get the students and young people involved in the museum. So they did something radical in terms of structure. They changed their curatorship to include a curator of public engagement. She wasn't a member of the visitor services department or the education department. She was a full senior curator, and her job was to animate the spaces in such a way that people would become much more engaged in the museum. They brought in all sorts of artists. Mark Allen and his Machine Project in the first year did 80 concerts in the closet under the stairs. There you see it, for 2 people at a time. They called them Little Richard concerts. And they did them virtually every day for people coming through. They did a dream in where you could come and sleep overnight at the museum and then share your dreams the following morning. They did a fungi festival where you could dress up as a fungus and play with funguses and see paintings about funguses and meet other fungi, presumably. All sorts of things to bring people in and engage them into they did a ping pong festival in the corridors for a month. And now what's happened is that people are coming to the exhibits far more than before, and there's a young crowd that sees Hammer now as a place where things happen. These are all ways in which these organizations have changed the structure of the way they do things. And the Denver Center Theater Company, too, a big organization, the biggest regional theater company in the Central Rockies region, had 4 theaters, and one of them was empty. And so they said, what can we do to bring in younger, more adventurous theatergoers to our complex? And they put the answer to that question in the hands of their youngest staff, who are all in their 20s, all digital natives, all very technologically savvy, and all very connected to the youth art scene around Denver. And they created what they call Off-Center at the Jones. Jones is the theater. And they created a whole season of prototypes working with local artists' collectives. One of them was the ultimate Wii baseball game, where they used the Wii to actually have the audience engage in the baseball game as the performance, with all the mascots and kissograms and you name it that form part of that. They did a history of hip-hop jambalaya, they called it, through food and dance and music, and having the audience being part of that. And they discovered what things would draw in the younger and more adventurous theatergoer. To such an extent, they're now in their 2nd full season. And in the first season, the board of the theater put up 100,000, which they got matched in the community to make this happen. In season 2, they put up 600,000. So they've really taken this seriously. And perhaps most important, the artistic director has now invited the off-center team to produce one of the main stage shows in the next season. So what was once a little separate thing in a small theater has become part of the way they think about their main stage. Now, you might say these stories are all about particular organizations that were highly innovative, but actually one of the things we've learned in our work is that you can systematize innovation. Innovation is not creativity. Creativity is a characteristic of individuals. Some people are just incredibly good at coming up with original and divergent ideas, and you need creative thinkers to innovate. But innovation is the conversion or development of those ideas into new strategies that organizations can actually implement. So that's group work. That takes people working together, and every organization can learn it. We now see innovation as an organizational discipline that every organization can learn. And we were somewhat confirmed in this view by a report from the Kellogg Foundation about 4 years ago, in which they recommended that nonprofits should see innovation as a part of their core competencies. They said it's a rational process with its own processes and procedures and tools that every organization should take on and become adept at. I like the title of their report. They called it Intentional Innovation. And we've tried to take the lessons from that and our own research into our own programs. We have all these different programs across the United States now, national labs for the performing arts and museums, a whole set of local programs that encourage and share and celebrate and build the skills of organizations in adapting. And we have an online presence called artsforward.org, which if you haven't been to, I do recommend. It has stories and ideas and tools and techniques you can use, not just from our own programs, but from organizations all across the country whose stories we've captured. We have a big national challenge, adaptive change challenge on at the moment. So let me conclude just by giving you a few thoughts about what it seemed to me, all this change that's going on and what we're learning means for cultural policy. So I have 3 questions that were in my mind. What is cultural policy when we're in an age of complex systems? How can we foster the conditions that will lead to next practices? And how might funders participate? So I didn't want to answer any of those questions. They were too hard, so I'll give you some not answers. But just some thoughts to finish. Because cultural policy, in a way, in the past, often tended to be a sense of what is a collective vision here? What are the principles or values or beliefs that underlie our sense of how the arts might develop in our community, our province, or our country, backed up with a sense of some goals and some strategies as to how we might get there, even some preferred behaviors and a call to action. It's all terrifically logical, but unfortunately pretty much useless in the context of complexity. It's very much like that top right-hand corner. It deals with complicated situations well, but does that kind of thinking really help when it comes to complex adaptive situations? And if not, what else can we do? Well, some of the things I think we can do are begin to acknowledge that we are in this complex arena in which the world we live in and the world we do our work in is changing very rapidly in new ways. The Polish philosopher and sociologist Zygmunt Bauman writes about this in a book called Liquid Modernity, that we live now untied from the social mores of the past, where individuals are, in a sense, adrift with their own particular interests, meeting often on the web, people of similar interests, but not having the kind of interactions that we're used to in the past. We may think of this as a time of enormous connectivity, but it's also a time of great fragmentation in which people are looking for meaning. They're looking to come together in ways that will be really meaningful. And we need to acknowledge the fact that there is this deep search for meaning that is peculiar to the 21st century, I think. And if we can recognize that, then maybe we can be bold about the role of the arts in this era. And I say the importance of, the benefits of artistic practice by all citizens, not for them. I'm influenced by Charlie Ledbetter, whom you may know as the guy who sort of identified the pro-am movement. Some of Charlie's recent work is on the idea of to and for versus by and with, and that the arts in the past have often been for organizations or something that's done to them, to the public. We provide a product, and nowadays it's all about by and with. So in a way, it's about artistic practice by our citizens, not artistic products given to them. And it's vital because we might argue that during this time, the arts, actually an artistic experience, artistic practice, is at the very root of who we are as human beings. Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist in Los Angeles, has identified the American crisis in public education as a crisis of citizenship, because he says we're no longer turning out people to vote when they get to the age of 18 that have the capacity in their brains to do the complex brain work that we need to be an effective voter in a mature democracy, because they weren't brought up with any arts education at all. And all those things that happen in artistic practice, the use of the tolerance for ambiguity, the simultaneous but contradictory truths that we live with, the deferring of decision-making, the appreciative inquiry, all these things the arts teach us have fallen away from our education systems and maybe fallen away from our communities in many ways. This is the way back to the arts perhaps having a vital role in our communities. And it did also occur to me that when we put together cultural policy, we often think we have to really hone a carefully arrived at vision that maybe we spend a hell of a lot of time consulting around, and we have to practice really hard before we do anything at all. Well, I think the ethos of action these days is about having a good enough vision and getting on with a lot of experiments, and I encourage you to do that. Often people say that innovation is betting the house on an untested idea. I say it's the very opposite. It's small experiments with radical intent. Small experiments with radical intent is the way I encourage you to move forward. So if, in fact, we are in this emergent or complex environment, how can we foster these kinds of conditions? Well, I think there are a few things we can do. We can certainly put an emphasis on this idea of prototyping. We try to do that in all our work because it's something that the arts has not done a lot. That is to say, the testing out of new strategies in low-stakes environments and the assessment of them really carefully, the improvement and repetition, and then finally the launch. So you learn about the strategy before you launch it. And our programs help provide grants to underwrite that kind of prototyping. I think prototyping is a really important thing to do in the arts that we don't do enough. And constructive failure, learning to fail early and fail often. They say in the innovation field, if you're not failing often enough, you're not doing well. It's the ability to fail that gives us the information we need to do well. So having a tolerance for failure, supporting failure so we can actually arrive at new ventures, I think is really important. It's also important to change the stories we tell, I think. We live in an age of interdependence, yet we often act and tell stories, again, as if they were totally separate from each other. How can we provide incentives for organizations to act collectively and break down these barriers, not just within the arts, but between the arts and other sectors? And I'm stealing something from Brenda Zimmerman in Canada in this one. Go for multiple actions at the fringes. In complex systems, innovation and change generally happens around the fringes and then affects the center after a while. Don't think you can take on the center at first, but you can create enough energy around the fringes that direction will arise. And then what about funders? How can funders participate? Well, I've got lots of things on this one. But I think one thing, basically, is that funders have also, and the individuals who work for funding institutions, they have to be adaptive leaders themselves. In the United States, there's a great concern that many of our funders are laggards in this regard. Everett Rogers, who wrote the sort of definitive tome on the diffusion of innovations across fields, likes to talk about the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. What happens if your gatekeepers, who control a lot of the ways in which innovations are adopted, are in the late majority or the laggards? They wait and see. Well, the answer is it slows down the whole thing. So it's very important that funders are also among the early adopters, and they are actually actively embracing this kind of change, and that their leaders be adaptive in their approach, so that they bring people together in new ways to address complex challenges. I think this also means moving from my left-hand side of my graph to the right. You've had a major stabilization project in the province and across the country, and I come out of that background. But now I see support for innovation and adaptability as the logical next step that changes, that swings the balance across towards adaptability, so that finding support for innovation and adaptive change is now really important. But I've also learned it's not just about money. No amount of money will make adaptive change happen unless the will is there. It's about the people and their will in the organization. So finding a lot of incentives and a way to build will in organizations for change and backing it up with periodic and increasing investment into not our traditional planning efforts, but actually this rethinking and incubation of new approaches. So watch this space. We'll be saying more about that soon. But I think examples like the Memphis Symphony, like the Center of Creative Arts in St. Louis, are some of the organizations that are beginning to use this practice more broadly beyond the arts as well as within it. And you were kind enough to refer to my slides and all that. I forgot to say, as I always do, that we will, of course, make these available to you. So I know you've been scribbling, some of you madly, but we will make the slides available as soon as we can.
I'd like to add that we're very hopeful that we might see Richard again in the not-too-distant future to present one of his more intensive workshops in adaptive change. So we're looking forward to a discussion about that possibility. And we'll let you all know if that's happening, because I'm sure there'll be people in this room who'd be very interested. I have a question about whether you have seen in government policy yet any leaders in adapting to a new era and really supporting the type of innovation that reflects a new reality.
Yeah, I mean, as you'll know, in the United States, we don't really have anything called cultural policy. There is no significant government-led sense of policy for the country. The NEA is a very small organization. I came from working in and around the Arts Council in the UK, which is like a gorilla. I mean, it's huge. It's much bigger than when I left the country. But you can't do anything in the arts in England unless you take account of the government policies being put forward through the Arts Council. And of course, it's closer to that here than it is in the United States. So what we find is that the strategic emphases and the new practices come up through the private foundation movement much more than they do through government. And there are a number of private funders who have more strategic maneuverability that I think it's worth watching for what they're doing. The Doris Duke Foundation is one of the most obvious. It supports our innovation lab for the performing arts, but a lot of other programs too, all of which are seeking to encourage and create conditions for next practices and organizational transformation. And I think they're a really important funder. We're seeing a few others like that. The James Irvine Foundation in California is moved in that direction. Even the Rockefeller Foundation, which has innovation in its sort of bones, is looking at how to be more constructive in helping propel and support adaptive change across the arts community. So there are these private foundations. I think at the NEA, which has certainly become a lot more strategic under Rocco Landsman in a way, a lot more active anyway, has done big initiatives like Art Place, which actually is a public-private partnership, 15 foundations in the NEA, coming together to do major grants to help what they call creative placemaking. It's a buzzword these days, but I think what it is in part about is community revitalization through the arts and using artists in new ways. There's a particularly wonderful organization that we worked with that was part of Art Place called Springboard for the Arts, that some of you may know in Minneapolis, which is really about giving artists agency in the community beyond traditional kind of business workshops and so on. They have marvelous programs that are kind of leading the way. So what we tend to see in the States is a few foundations leading the way and a lot of individual organizations that are supported by those foundations to do strategic work. What we don't see is any significant kind of national rhetoric or policy coming out of the government that could, in a sense, drive these other players in the field forward faster. And as I was saying, this is one of our problems because it means that a lot of the gatekeepers in our field, not just the federal and state agencies, but also the service organizations in our field, tend actually to be very conservative and what Everett Rogers calls laggards. So they tend to squelch the green shoots of deviant behavior. What can I say? That in fact are the signs of things changing. If you know Jerry Sternin in his work, he was the guy who wrote the book called The Power of Positive Deviance. It's a really good study about how you can really support just small experiments that can change fundamentally the nature of the way communities work. And we're fortunate to have the foundations because they're the counteraction to the very conservative service organizations and a lot of the funders in the US.
If I could just add, we do have developments in Canada where foundations and public sector
You've come together.
Institutions are actually coming together to talk, and there are some progressive foundations, not many, most not here, you can see, but
Yeah.
they do exist, and it is a growing conversation
Sure.
in Canada.
Yeah, and
It's the plan.
And I've had a number of meetings with the Canada Council as well as most of the provincial arts councils about how they might foster this kind of change and be more inclusive in the way they think about that. So I think there's interest and there's some encouraging signs. Yeah, I agree. Hello.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Laborde, executive producer at Dreamwriter Productions. We have been a theater company and now we're doing multimedia as well.
Wow.
And I really enjoyed your talk. We do pretty much most of the things that you're talking about there we're doing. I'm an adaptive leader, which means I don't know what the heck I'm doing. But I love the term adaptive leader. That's way better.
And Heifetz does say to help us all that no one knows what they're doing as an adaptive leader because we're all in way over our heads.
And we've actually been working with the social innovators in the business field in terms of our theater company, our practice, and that's been really fantastic, highly recommended. But what's happening for us is that we have an incredibly innovative product. I call it a product, sorry. And we've taken our practices in theater and in environmental change that we've been doing, which I'll talk about in a bit, and we've created something which is a new form. And as a result, it's really hard to communicate about it. People constantly misunderstand what it is and they miss it because they think it's X when it's actually kind of this sphere. I'm wondering if you have any general principles in terms of talking to the laggards or even the early adopters about innovation in terms of communicating what you're doing. So mostly we're doing it just on our own and then we just go and do it and then eventually people go, cool. But it would be lovely to get people on board sort of along the way.
Well, it's complicated that. I understand the dilemma. Sometimes I find myself saying that we're so used in the arts to advocacy and to advocacy movements that what we really need to do is create an inquiry movement because in some ways, I know this from my experience working with groups in our labs, that when they go through this transformative experience and they've got this terrific new project that a group of maybe of 10 of them has created, they have to go back to their organizations and they have these kind of halos on. And they're not necessarily welcomed with open arms because doing things differently and a group of people who are championing that are really telling me that I've got to do more work I don't know how to do, and so on and so forth. So we've learned to encourage these groups not to go back and kind of sell or not to try and use traditional advocacy, but to actually use questioning and inquiry around how to create connections with where people are. So your new form may be complex, so you have to find ways to be where people are and invite them into that, not by telling them about it, but by inquiring about how they can relate to it and where they're coming from. And I think there's a lot of techniques of appreciative inquiry that can be used to help bridge that gap. And I think there's another thing. I think a lot of people feel if they're outside the arts or they're individuals we'd like to engage in it, they feel very ill-equipped. They feel like they're outsiders when we use a lot of the jargon of our field. And I've learned that doing innovation we need to remember that it's all about incompetence. There's a competency model of learning that some of you may know, that before you start doing anything, you're usually unconsciously incompetent. You don't know anything about it. You don't even know what you don't know. Then if it comes onto your radar, you become consciously incompetent. In other words, you know what you need to learn. Then over time, you become consciously competent, and you know what you've learned. And ultimately, maybe you become unconsciously incompetent, which is where you've arrived at, I'm sure, very quickly with the new way of doing things. But my point is that if you think of that as a square from bottom left to top left, we spend all our professional lives generally on the left-hand side. We're either expected to be unconsciously competent or it's off our radar. And innovation is all about living on the right-hand side. And I found it's emotionally very different, and it requires a different kind of communication when you're working with things which are being tested, which have never been around before, where even people inside the organization can often feel like they might be shown up. They don't really know quite how to do this. And learning to be generous and to be very empathetic about people's activities and their skills and their interests is all what it's about on the right-hand side of this, being consciously incompetent and consciously competent. So a lot of the people you're trying to communicate to are people who, as regards your new form, are actually sort of just becoming consciously incompetent. And that's a sensitive place to be in which they can easily be closed down, or they just will put up a defense. So everything you can do to learn how to be where they are and to ask them questions that can help you understand what they need to know, rather than, as I think we're all inclined to do, because we really passionately believe in it, to tell people about the new thing. The more you hold that back, actually, the more the conversation will actually develop. That would be think about those kinds of approaches to inquiry, I think.
Is it a quick follow-up, Judith?
Oh,
One of the strategies we use is to have people experience the work themselves.
Yes.
Experiential learning is invaluable.
Right.
You don't have to use words because experience speaks for you.
Thanks. My name's Nancy Noble. I'm the director of the Museum of Vancouver. And over the last 5 years, we've gone through significant change of a very old institution. It's been around since 1894. And museums, as you probably know, are fairly traditional, small C conservative organizations. And it's interesting because you validated so much of what we've done over the last 5 years and still have a great deal of work to do. But we've had a curator of audience engagement for 4 years. So. But I think the hardest part, and it's really more a comment, but I'll love if you could respond to it, is the question of risk. And taking risk, and not just taking risk, but actually being able to admit that we failed, because we've had lots of failures over the last 5 years. And I find that as a community, we don't talk about those things with each other, let alone to the people who fund and support us, or the board of directors saying, well, why did you do that exhibit then? How come it didn't bring in all those people? Well, it was an experiment, and partly we have to look at how we're evaluating things, because just how many people come through the door is not necessarily the best way to evaluate anything. But we have to get funders and board members and even the community to understand that in order to innovate and to push the boundaries of what a museum could be, and that's what we're trying to do, we have to be able to stand up and say, yeah, we failed, but that's okay, because next time we're gonna do it differently, or learn from it, or do it better. And it's a really tough thing to do, and I find that we don't do it as well, I think, as we could. And if we talked about it more, if we all talked about it more, I think it would be easier for all of us to have our failures.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been absolutely deeply embedded as an assumption in our field that you cannot talk about failure. Certainly with funders and politicians, it's all got to be about success, right? It's all rhetoric about success, because that's what pays. That's what's become part of the culture of the field. So it's a real culture shift to be able to talk about productive or constructive failure. And I suppose I do encourage you to start with small experiments, because what you don't want to do is take on a major risk and have a significant failure early on. What you've got to do is get early wins, because it's the early wins that begin to shift the climate inside the organization. So, some people come to me and say, can we have $50,000 to prototype this? I say, no, let's talk about 500. And then maybe 5,000. A lot of organizations are putting small sums aside in order to do these very early experiments, but then making them really visible and telling the stories of those early successes, which may not be earth-shattering, but you can use those to kind of soften up the culture of the organization and gradually increase the risk and the size of your failures when there's more tolerance for it. And I do agree with you, it's also a matter of developing a vocabulary around evaluation. Again, I encourage you to look at the work of Francis Westley and Michael Quinn Patton and Jamie Gamble in developmental evaluation as a way of coming to grips with this, because most of our evaluation is based on looking backwards at whether or not we achieved what we did, doing mid-course corrections, but there's really not much use when you're doing a new venture, when you're in that kind of almost chaotic situation I was describing. So what are the new measures, which are substantially about learning? And I think we used to think of learning as a soft output or outcome. I think now can be made into a really good one. How rigorously can we learn from what we're doing in relatively short feedback loops and then improvements? That's the new way of thinking about it. So setting up measures like that, rather than relying upon the sort of translation of the traditional measures about number of people who came or what the box office take was or whatever, is urgent, because otherwise people will default to them, and which they do, and then it kills the innovation. So really work hard to set up a system of metrics that is suitable for the innovation. Start with small experiments, tell the stories of early wins, and don't bet the house on something that's really risky. I don't know if you know the story of the trim tab, but it always seems to me germane in this area, which is when they created the great big super tankers, they put rudders on the back, which were about, 3 times the height of this room. Enormous great rudders to change the direction of the super tankers. But when they tried to use them, they didn't work. They broke apart, because so strong was the inertia, the momentum of this huge ship, that it couldn't turn, and therefore the rudder fell apart. So what they learned was to cut a hole in the rudder near the bottom, of quite small, maybe a few feet by, maybe 10 feet by 12, and they put in a small little rudder called a trim tab. And that what they found is if you move the trim tab, you create disturbance around the rudder, which in due course allows you to turn the rudder and then to turn the ship. So the secret to large-scale change with big institutions or big policies is not to try and create a dirty great rudder the size of the room and move it. It's to create a trim tab. And these small experiments and this idea of deviant activity at the fringes is all about the trim tab. So think in terms of trim tabs and how you can actually invest or create programs that will disturb the culture sufficiently to change the rudder and move the ship. Yeah.
We're going to go to this side, question waiting here, and we'll make this our final question.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. When I'm hearing the deviants, I'm thinking of, we had one in the room, where we had one yesterday, Max Wyman, when he wrote The Defiant Imagination, and I really highly recommend it for anybody reading it. Very interesting. On the sense of culture, because you were wondering whatever that is, right? A culture policy. Yeah. I'm just digging deeper into the sense of culture itself, and if I use the idea of agriculture, soil, and how this thing comes about, and we refer to it, and if you think of people, and in the sense that we are atoms, and the body politic of what we become. And I'm thinking here the mind ecology, right? And you start moving towards the languaging of what we mean by culture. Because if we're going to framework it, in this case, the policy, I'm just wondering if we got a sense of the deepest sense and meaning of culture. And I'm going back to the philosophy of I think, therefore I am. All of us in this room, right? We go through this process and we become something, and then we express something, and then we move towards what people refer to as culture, the expression of something. So from your own experience, you've traveled, right, around, you've looked at different worlds, you've looked at different countries, and my understanding is you have a deep experience within the United States at this point, right?
Yeah.
And also you've bridged over to another experience, a body politic called Canada, and it kind of sits there trying to find itself, searching for itself. What would be the deepest meaning you'd reach for to go and describe culture, which could guide us in when we think of setting policy for it, in the sense here? Thanks.
No pressure.
Yes, no pressure, that's right. I mean, it's a long time ago that they said culture is one of the hardest words to define in the English lexicon. It does have all these wonderful roots in agriculture in the sense of identity and what makes us who we are. And that's different in every country, different in every community in a way. And in some ways, I think the challenge overall we're facing that I tried to describe in my talk is of, in a funny kind of way, the so-called professional arts sector becoming a little bit separate from the culture, not necessarily growing from the roots upwards, but taken off and then presented back. And overcoming that distance and returning organizations to the deeper roots of our identity, I think is part of the challenge ahead of us. If I'm feeling radical, I sometimes say that we created 50 years building a professional arts sector, and our job now is to dissolve it. If only in the sense that what we want in the end is to have deeply expressive communities, a culture which is freely available in all its diversity and differentiation, that's inclusive of all the peoples in the country, rather than an arts club of people like most of us who enjoy these events. The two are not contradictory, but the one is a lot bigger than the other. So it's about going back to roots, and it's about spending a lot of time getting beyond, I think, the kind of lenses and assumptions and spectacles we wear when we look at the current reality until we really see its foundation. Those of you who study the theory U, as it's called, or the U process, will know that the roots of fundamental change and new ways of doing things lie not so much in letting go as in letting come. And that you have to reach a point where there is great clarity about who we are, and what we represent before you can begin to create a vision for where you want to go. And if you short-circuit that and you go straight from an analysis of current activity to a new kind of strategic approach, which will produce another reality, you'll miss all that stuff at the bottom of the U. Sounds a bit theoretical, but actually it's really emotional, and it's really about creating the will for change and rediscovering the roots that hold us together. I can't help but feel in the United States that we've particularly lost touch with that, and that culture has become extraordinarily commodified. And I meet a lot of organizations who will say absolutely sincerely that we just got to be more like entertainment. And if only every show was like a Broadway show would be great. Well, of course, it's in many ways, a separate set of dynamics. And although there are a lot of for-profit, non-profit partnerships that are valuable, I have to believe we have something really unique to offer about the human identity through the arts that is very different from entertainment, which generally either offers us a way to escape from or a reinforcement of existing values, whereas the arts are all about the questions and doubts that we raise and the way we grow as human beings. So I think looking back to the roots of the idea of culture, and that it's in the country, it's in the natural surroundings and the way we relate to them, is a way to sort of reground ourselves in the things that matter about who we are. And when we say that, we've got to be inclusive. We've got to look beyond the usual suspects, as I was saying in my last slide there, and really think again about how culture can be returned to our citizens and to the people, and to grow rather than be just harvested by a professional sector. So I see very different cultures in different countries, but where there's a sense of vibrancy and where the arts are really central, it's where the arts speak for the deeper roots of identity in that particular country or community. I think we must always aspire to that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you.